Professor John Keane, you've been described by the Australian Broadcasting Commission as one of the great intellectual experts from Australia. You were born in Australia, but your ancestors came from Ireland.
My father was Irish and from a poor, landless, famine-stricken family. They emigrated in search of a better life. And I would say that half of my genes are Irish. My mother's side was English, dissenting Protestants who came to Australia also in search of a better life and were very strong parliamentary Democrats, let's say. So this is a rather unholy mixture.
Is that what prepared you for your search for democracy and then to become a world-renowned specialist in democratic thought?
Well, we are all carriers of many experiences and our lives are made up of many rooms. Several of mine certainly are. And my memories from childhood are strong along those lines. There was a strong sensitivity to empire in Australia in the period in which I grew up. I mean, against the British Empire. The feeling that the local experiment should be different, that it could borrow from many places, and that, above all, it disliked arrogance, hubris, that it believed in the rule of law, in elections, and it was a place, something of a laboratory, where institutions were invented for the first time in the world. The secret ballot, for instance. Women got the vote first, and the right to stand in my own state of South Australia. That's something of which I'm proud. There are ugly sides as well.
Well, I wonder where you see Australia now, being part of the war on terrorism, part of the alliance that invaded Iraq, and with the ugly riots that we saw recently showing signs of growing racism against newcomers.
All of that is ugly. It has deep roots historically. But there's no doubt that it's being nurtured by government policy and government strategy in the world. And I think one of the tragic things when historians look back on this period, looking at that little would-be republic in the Pacific, South Pacific Ocean, is the way in which it willfully joined the United States in breaking up institutions, in acting bilaterally, acting like a bull in a china shop, all of which I think has been bad for world politics.
Now, toward the end of the 80s of the 20th century, you set up the Center for the Study of Democracy.
I did.
At what is today the University of Westminster. And those were moments in the history of the modern world when more nations were joining the democratic club. There was euphoria about this. But when I met you just 3 years later, it was about 1992 that we met, we were actually seeing the first sign of an attack on democracy because of what happened in Algeria. Where do you see the world today?
Well, it's true that there was a phase of euphoria that in my own work I think I trace back really to the years after 1945. It wasn't just a product of the so-called Velvet Revolutions of 1989 to 91. I mean, the renaissance of democracy should be credited to India. In 1945, it is a miracle that any power-sharing constitutional democracy survived in the European region. Britain was one of the very few exceptions, and even it was in trouble. Of course there was America, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, but on the face of the earth, there had been a serious half-century-long crisis that almost destroyed democracies, and out of the ruins came totalitarian forms of power, dictatorship, monarchies, the restoration of monarchy. And India, this completely surprising development, with no thanks to the British, and no support for
Despite the British, actually.
Despite the British, it managed to create a new model of power sharing that today survives despite everything, despite the violence, despite the pauperization, despite the conflict of religion and ethnicity. And so the renaissance of democracy is traceable back to that period, and we then saw the collapse of dictatorships in Latin America, in the Philippines. We saw, of course, the heroic Polish events of 1980, 1981, and the resistance to Soviet power. And we saw these events culminate, so to say, in those revolutions of 89 to 91. And it's not surprising that many journalists and intellectuals, writers, politicians even, saw that this was a great triumph of democracy. It was done without much historical understanding, with a lot of amnesia, and a lot of inflated expectations. And as you rightly say, by the early 90s, the signs of decadence, of instability, of hypocrisy concerning democracy began to surface. And we are now living in times in which one can say there is a bad moon rising over democracy everywhere.
And in the early 90s, we saw the abortion of a democratic experiment in Tunisia, followed by an abortion of an experiment toward democratization in Algeria.
With the support of democracies.
With the support of the major liberal democracies of the world, France in particular. Now that phase you've just spoken about, which started with India taking the lead in the building of democratic institutions, that's the phase in your forthcoming book, The Life and Death of Democracy, you refer to as the last phase of the life of democracy. Now, earlier you speak about two phases. The very first phase is the one that you trace not as people usually do in Greece, but elsewhere.
Perhaps I can tell you about this. I mean, there are various ways of thinking about the whole history of democratic institutions as we have come to know them and as people knew them in the past. Broadly, I think, and it's of course an arbitrary way of categorizing, but it's one that I find very fruitful. Broadly speaking, there have been three phases in the history of democratic institutions. The first is assembly-based democracy. The second is representative democracy. And I think, beginning with India, which, as I've said already, should be credited with its path-breaking experiment in constitutional power sharing, I think in India we have seen the birth of what I want to call complex democracy. Three phases: assembly, representative, complex democracy. The scandal that I hope to, minor scandal anyway, to generate in my book, is that the custom and convention has been that assembly-based democracy, direct democracy, so-called, began in Athens. Or some have made the amendment to say that it began at least in other Greek democracies, city-states, of which there were something like 200, and about which we know very little until, have known very little until recently, because of the predominance of Athens as an imperial power in classical Greece. The scandal is that the language of democracy, demokratia, is much older than classical Greek.
It sounds very Arabic, demokratia.
It is certainly a word that is traceable to Linear B, to the language of the Mycenaean civilization. That means approximately 1500 BCE. And root words like damu, referring to a body of people who seek to gain power, to exercise power. That word is certainly Sumerian, and that takes it back into the world of ancient Mesopotamia, where one can say assemblies were born. The assembly, a meeting of people who consider each other equals, who come together to decide how they want to live on the face of the earth, who will get what, when, and how. This is not a Greek invention. It is not a European invention. It's not a Western invention. It is actually an invention of the East, of what is today Iraq and Iran. It was in ancient Mesopotamia, beginning 2,500 years BCE, that assemblies were first born. Kings were elected. Commoners attended these assemblies. For example, in matters of law, of theft of property, of violence against others, assemblies were convened to decide what justice would be meted out. And these assemblies were transported partly to the east, in what is today Pakistan and Western India, and they were transported to the west through the Phoenicians, through city-states like Byblos, for instance, and then into the Greek world, which claimed these assemblies as their own creation and as a sign of their superiority over the barbarians of the East. So this is a story that I want to tell, and it has to be part of the history of democracy, that it, so to say, all began.
And unlike many narratives of the history of democracy, you shed light on the role the Muslims played in all of this.
In every standard history of democracy in virtually any language that I know or am familiar with or have had translated or have come across, there is utter silence about what happens from the time of the birth of the Prophet until, let's say, approximately 1000 CE.
As if that period never existed.
Doesn't exist. And when it is mentioned, Professor John Donne's recent writing on the history of democracy in Cambridge has reinforced this. The remarks are scathing. You know, the problem is that Muslims never encountered the language of democracy. They didn't understand what was at stake. They had no experience of a whole tradition of institutions and political thinking. And this, I'm afraid, is just bad Orientalism.